in the spring of 1889. Workmen renovating an aging manor house along the Connecticut River Valley stumbled upon something the household had never intended to be found. Tucked within a sealed gap between the original stone wall and a later oak-paneled addition, they uncovered a bundle of 17 letters, secured with a black ribbon that had grown stiff as wire over the years. The foreman who first opened the packet later admitted he had read no more than the first 3 lines of the initial letter before folding it back up and quitting the property altogether. He never returned to claim his pay. The letters were addressed to a woman who had been deceased for more than 3 decades. They recounted, with exacting and incriminating precision, a chain of events reaching back to the winter of 1843. Events the Aldridge family, one of Hartford County's most esteemed names, had spent 40 years and a substantial share of their fortune trying to ensure would never be uttered aloud. What those letters contained did more than embarrass the Aldridges. It undid them entirely. Within 18 months of the discovery, the eldest son had fled to Canada under an assumed identity. The family estate was sold at auction to settle a flood of legal claims. The patriarch, 81 years old, nearly blind, and still insisting that the entire affair was a fabrication, died alone in a rented room above a druggist's shop in Middletown. Before we proceed with the Aldridge family's story and the letters that brought them down, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a tale like this one. Drop a comment and tell us, where are you listening from tonight? What city? What state? We want to know who's out there in the dark with us. Because the dark, as the Aldridges discovered, has a remarkably long memory. The Connecticut River Valley in the early 1800s was a region that prided itself on its respectability. The towns lining the river, Middletown, Hartford, Wethersfield, Glastonbury, were old in the American sense, meaning they had been established long enough that their founding families had forgotten what uncertainty felt like. The valley had grown wealthy through trade, river commerce, tobacco, insurance, and manufacturing. By the 1840s, Hartford was the sort of city that sent its sons to Yale as a matter of course and expected them to return ready to manage money, institutions, and appearances in roughly that order. That sequence, money, institutions, appearances, was no accident. Appearances in this era of Connecticut functioned as a kind of infrastructure. They upheld credit, which sustained commerce, which preserved the household, the name, and the standing. Managing appearances was not viewed as dishonesty. It was seen as the routine work of civilized society. It was the maintenance of a shared fiction that allowed people of different stations to coexist under a common set of acknowledged rules. The rules in 1840s Hartford were elaborate. They governed who could sit in which church pew, who could serve on which committee, who could be visited and who could be called upon, who required an introduction and who merely a greeting. These distinctions mapped onto a social hierarchy that was never formally codified but was understood by everyone within it as instinctively and precisely as a musician reads a score. This was the world into which Patience Cobb had been placed as a young woman, and in which she had lived, like domestic servants do, simultaneously inside and outside the family's intimate life. She ate in the kitchen, managed the functions that made the household's social performances possible, and understood the machinery behind the performance in the way stagehands understand the theater. From that vantage point, if you paid attention, you could see more of what was actually happening than the audience ever would. The Aldridges had been managing appearances since at least 1701, when the first of them, Cornelius Aldrich, arrived from Rhode Island with modest capital and immense ambition. purchased farmland along the river's eastern bank, and began the slow ascent toward becoming someone worth knowing. His descendants had prospered. By the early 1840s, they were in their fourth generation of Connecticut prominence. They owned the manor house that would later be renovated, a profitable stake in a Hartford insurance firm, a smaller property in Glastonbury for shade tobacco cultivation, and the kind of social standing that needed no announcement. The head of the family in 1843 was Harlan Aldridge, then in his mid-30s. By all accounts, he was an effective and largely humorless man. He ran the insurance business with precision, served on 2 charitable boards, attended services at Hartford's Center Church with a regularity that signaled status rather than devotion, and had been married since 1838 to Eliza, Nene Storrow, from a respectable Springfield family. Everyone agreed Eliza was considerably more perceptive than her husband, though no one would have said so to his face. They had 3 children by 1843. The eldest, a boy named Harlan Jr., called Henry within the family to distinguish him from his father, was 5 years old, with 2 younger daughters. The household also included, as was customary for prosperous Connecticut families, several domestic servants, a groundskeeper, and a housekeeper named Patience Cobb, who had worked for the Aldridges since before Harlan Sr married Eliza, before he took over the business from his own father, and before, some said, the house itself had acquired its reputation for cold rooms and drafts with no apparent origin. Patience Cobb was 53 in 1843. She was a widow whose husband had died of a chest ailment in the winter of 1831, leaving her childless and without property of her own. She had come to work for the Aldridges as a young woman, and the house had become the whole of her world. She knew where everything was, knew the habits of every room, and this would become significant. Knew things about the family that the family did not realize she knew. The winter of 1843 arrived early and lingered in the Connecticut River Valley. By November, ice had begun to form along the river's edges, and the roads between Hartford and the outlying towns turned treacherous with mud and frozen ruts that made travel difficult, and, when a wheel broke or a horse stumbled, genuinely dangerous. Into this gray, close, and unforgiving winter, the events began to move that would eventually be sealed inside a wall and forgotten, or nearly forgotten, for 46 years. The night of December 3, 1843, was not one anyone at the Aldrich estate was meant to remember for any particular reason. Harlan Sr had returned from Hartford in the late afternoon, arriving as the sky darkened over the river, and the temperature plummeted from its midday high. It was the kind of Connecticut winter evening where the cold feels deliberate, and the bare trees along the drive stand in the fading light like figures that have chosen not to move. He arrived in better spirits than usual. A change Patience Cobb noted with the precision of someone who had tracked a man's moods long enough to know when a shift in them meant something. He had been in Hartford all day on business and had returned with company. Eliza had supervised the children's supper and early bedtime. The household's evening meal was prepared and served, as it always was, the good china on the dining table, the lamps lit, the fire built high in the hearth until the room was warm in that specific way of a house with thick walls, good wood, and people who knew how to use them. The smell of the dining room that evening, roasted meat, candle wax, and the particular sweetness of apple wood burning, Patience Cobb recorded as an incidental detail, as though she were simply noting everything she observed rather than selecting for significance. Daniel Ferris, 26 years old, recently engaged, hired as a clerk in the insurance office, had arrived at the manor house that afternoon in Harlan Sr's company and had been invited to stay the night due to the worsening weather. He was by Patience Cobb's brief description. A young man of pleasant manners and a certain eagerness to please, that people in subordinate professional positions sometimes develop when they understand their advancement depends on the goodwill of a specific person. He thanked Patience for preparing the guest room, carried his own bag upstairs, and appeared to be an ordinary guest in ordinary circumstances. This detail, the presence of Daniel Ferris, would become in retrospect the hinge on which everything else turned. What is known, or what can be reconstructed from the evidence that later emerged, is this: Daniel Ferris did not sleep in the guest room assigned to him that night. Sometime between 10 in the evening and 3 in the morning, he was elsewhere in the house. And during those same hours, Eliza Aldridge was not in the bedroom she shared with her husband, who, according to his own later account, was sleeping under the influence of laudanum prescribed for recurring back pain. It is also known that Patience Cobb, whose room was on the ground floor near the kitchen, did not sleep at all that night. She heard things. The house made its ordinary nighttime sounds: the settling of old stone against newer wood, the movement of air through corridors never fully sealed against winter, the distant sound of the river when the wind was right. But beneath those ordinary sounds, she heard something else: footsteps that did not fit the pattern of a household at rest. A door that opened and did not immediately close, voices, very low, in the corridor above the kitchen. Not words she could transcribe, but voices carrying a specific emotional register. She recognized the low urgency of people who do not want to be heard. She saw, through a partially open door, something she was not meant to see. And she wrote it down, not immediately, not that night, but within the following days, in a letter addressed to her sister in New Haven. A letter she ultimately did not send, but kept instead, folded inside a larger bundle that she added to over the years with the methodical quiet precision of someone who understands that truth, if it is to be useful, must be preserved in a form that will survive. The morning after Daniel Ferris spent the night at the Aldridge estate, he left before breakfast. Harlan Sestern saw him off at the door, and by every visible sign, parted from him as an employer bidding a valued employee a comfortable journey. Eliza did not come downstairs until mid-morning, complaining of a headache. The children were kept in the nursery. 3 weeks later, Daniel Ferris resigned his position at the insurance concern, citing a desire to pursue an opportunity in Boston. Harlan Sester provided him with a letter of recommendation that was, by the standards of such letters, unusually warm. Ferris departed for Boston in January 1844, and as far as the official record goes, had no further contact with the Aldridge family. But the official record, as Patience Cobb well understood, is not the only kind. What Patience Cobb had seen through that partially open door on the night of December 3 was not by itself necessarily the thing that unraveled everything. Affairs among the wealthy classes of mid-19th century New England were not precisely common knowledge, but neither were they unheard of. What made the Cobb letters, for that is what they eventually became, different from a simple account of marital infidelity, was what Patience Cobb understood about the context in which that night had occurred. To explain this, it is necessary to go back slightly further in the story, to the summer and autumn of 1843, before Daniel Ferris arrived at the manor house with Harlan Sr. on that cold December afternoon. In the summer of 1843, a young woman named Mercy Dunbar came to work at the Aldridge estate as a household servant. She was 17. The daughter of a farming family from Glastonbury, brought in to help with the increased labor after another servant left to marry. Mercy Dunbar was, by all accounts, a quiet and industrious girl, not without intelligence, possessing a directness of manner that Patience Cobb would later describe in her letters as both her greatest quality and the quality that most imperiled her. By September of 1843, Mercy Dunbar had attracted the attention of Harlan Aldridge Sr. in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Patience Cobb saw this. She had worked for the family long enough to recognize what she was looking at. She had also worked for the family long enough to understand that the correct response in the practical calculus of her position was to see nothing, say nothing, and file everything away in the part of her mind where other such things were already filed. What complicated the situation, and what gave Patience Cobb's eventual account its particular weight, was that Eliza Aldridge also saw what was happening, and Eliza Aldridge, who was, as everyone agreed, considerably more perceptive than her husband, drew a conclusion that her husband had apparently not considered, that the best way to redirect a dangerous situation was to provide a substitute for the danger. Daniel Ferris was not, in other words, a random choice. He was a young man of relatively modest means and significant ambitions, employed in her husband's own business, and therefore someone whose discretion could reasonably be counted upon. He was also, and Patience Cobb recorded this with the careful precision of someone who understood she was writing history, someone for whom Eliza Aldridge had developed a genuine attachment over the preceding year through the ordinary, social contacts of a businessman's household. Dinners, holiday gatherings, the incidental proximity of a small professional world. Whether Eliza's calculation was correct, whether she believed that redirecting her husband's attention by occupying her own was a rational strategy, or whether the rationalization came later to explain something that had happened for simpler reasons, is a question the letters leave open. What they do not leave open is the sequence of events, or the fact that Patience Cobb, from her position of invisible domestic authority, had observed most of it with the thoroughness of a woman who had learned over decades of service that the powerful are observed most accurately by those they have learned to look through. By the spring of 1844, Mercy Dunbar had left the Aldrich household. The official reason given was that she had returned to her family in Glastonbury. Patience Cobb's letters suggest a different story, that Mercy Dunbar had left because she had been given a sum of money and a clear understanding of what would happen to her family's tenancy on Aldrich land. The Dunbars rented from an estate connected to the Aldrich tobacco interest. If she failed to depart quietly and permanently, her family would suffer. This too Patience Cobb had seen, and this too she had written down. The years following 1844 were, on the surface, years of consolidation and quiet success for the Aldridge family. Harlan Sr. expanded the insurance concern. The elder son Henry was sent to a preparatory school in New Haven, then to Yale as expected. The daughters made respectable marriages. Eliza Aldridge became, as the decades passed, the kind of matriarch praised for her composure and charitable work. A woman whose early beauty had settled into serene authority. If she and Harlan Sr. had an understanding between them, if the events of December 1843 had produced not rupture but a particular kind of equilibrium, a shared knowledge that bound them together in the way that only mutual compromises can, it showed itself nowhere visible. They appeared to the world as they had always appeared. Patience Cobb watched all of this. She continued to work for the family until her own age and failing health required her to retire in 1871, at which point she accepted a pension from the estate and moved to the home of a niece in Middletown. She was 71 years old. She took with her, in a cloth-covered document box that had belonged to her husband, the letters she had been writing and accumulating for 28 years. She died in 1875. The box passed to the niece, who had been told clearly and repeatedly not to open it, to hold it intact, and to surrender it only if anyone ever came asking, and only if they came asking honestly, meaning only if they already knew what was inside. No one came. Eliza Aldridge died in 1877. Harlan outlived her by 12 years, dying in 1889, the same year the workers opened the wall. In those intervening years, between Patience Cobb's retirement and her death, and the years after, the Aldridge family went on performing the rituals of Connecticut prosperity with the automatic fluency of people who had never had reason to question whether performance and reality were the same thing. The manor house was improved. New rooms added to the eastern wing. The original stone foundations reinforced. Certain sections of interior wall rebuilt to accommodate updated plumbing and heating arrangements. It was during one of these earlier renovations, sometime in the late 1850s or early 1860s, that the cavity in the wall had been created, or at least altered to its final form. Who placed the letters? There is not entirely clear from the documentary record, but the timing suggests it was after Patience Cobb had left domestic service. Whether she placed them herself on some final visit to the house, or through an intermediary, or whether they arrived in the wall by a different chain of hands, is one of the small unresolved questions that the story leaves permanently open. What is easier to account for is why they were placed there at all, rather than burned, kept openly, or surrendered to a lawyer. The answer, when you think carefully about the position Patience Cobb occupied, is not mysterious. A domestic servant who possessed documents damaging to her employer was not, in the mid-19th century Connecticut River Valley, someone with many options for how to use them. She could not publish them. She could not give them to a lawyer in her own right, since the legal system of the period offered limited standing to a woman of her station and no standing at all to someone making claims against a family like the Aldridges without substantial resources. She could try to extract some benefit by threatening disclosure, but that strategy required a willingness to be destroyed in the process. Because the Aldridges had tools for discrediting a domestic servant that she had no tools to answer. What she could do, and did, was keep. She kept the letters because keeping them was the only form of preservation available to her. She placed them eventually somewhere they would not be destroyed by accident or by the tidying impulses of a household that would otherwise have had every reason to clear out the papers of an elderly retired housekeeper. A wall is not a safe, but a wall is permanent in a way that a drawer or trunk or document box left to a niece is not quite permanent enough. The wall held them for somewhere between 20 and 30 years. It held them through 2 changes of household staff, through the deaths of both Henry Aldridge's parents, through the conversion of several rooms from their original purpose to new ones, and through the ordinary erosion of time on a house, maintained but not loved, kept functional but not cherished, operated as a property rather than inhabited as a home. And then the workers came with their tools in the spring of 1889, and then the wall gave them up. The foreman read 3 lines and walked away. The story that Patience Cobb had spent 28 years writing down began at last its journey toward the light. The niece, whose name was Clara Howd, was still alive in 1889. She had kept the box undisturbed for 14 years. When she read in the Middletown newspaper a brief item about renovations being undertaken at the old Aldridge estate, she made a decision. She did not send the letters to the family. She sent them to the family's lawyer. Not the current family lawyer, but the previous one, a man named Solomon Graves, who had retired from practice in Hartford and was known in a general way to have accumulated over his long career a quantity of information about powerful families that made him a person worth staying on reasonable terms with. Solomon Graves received the box from Clara Howard in April of 1889. He read its contents over 3 days. Then he wrote 2 letters. The first was to Henry Aldridge, Harlan Jr., now in his early 50s, the family patriarch in his father's absence. The second was to a man Henry Aldridge had never heard of, a journalist in New Haven. He sent both letters on the same afternoon. Henry Aldridge received Solomon Graves' letter on a Wednesday morning in late April. He read it standing in the hallway of the Hartford house, a newer townhouse purchased a decade earlier, when the manor had become impractical to maintain. His wife later reported that she knew from the look on his face before he had said a single word that something had shifted in the architecture of their lives. The letter from Solomon Graves was by the standards of blackmail, for that is ultimately what it was, performed with the careful indirection of a former lawyer who understood precisely how close to a line he could walk. It did not threaten, it informed. It conveyed the existence of a collection of letters describing events involving the Aldridge family between 1843 and 1871. It noted that these letters had recently come into Graves' possession and that he had read them with considerable attention. It expressed, in measured and almost sympathetic language, concern about what might happen were their contents to become unknown to persons outside the legal and confidential context in which Graves was sharing this information. And it concluded with a suggestion that a meeting between Graves and Henry Aldridge, at a time and place of Aldridge's choosing, might be productive for all parties. It said nothing about the journalist in New Haven. That letter, sent the same afternoon, told a different story to a different audience. Henry Aldridge did not respond to Graves' letter immediately. He was, by temperament, a man who did not act under pressure, who believed, in the way of men who have grown up watching power operate from a safe distance, that any problem can be managed if you do not panic, do not speak, and do not move too quickly. He spent a day and a half doing nothing visible, which is to say he spent a day and a half doing a great deal internally, reviewing the family's exposure, considering who else might know about the letters, calculating what Solomon Graves might actually want versus what he had said he wanted, and trying to determine whether there was any possibility that the contents of those letters were different from what his own memory and certain suppressed family knowledge suggested they would be. He had known, in some general way, about events in the 1840s that were not discussed. He had known, in the way that children know things they have absorbed from the atmosphere of a household, rather than from any direct disclosure, that there were arrangements and understandings in his parents' marriage that were not for public consumption. He had not known about Patience Cobb. He had not known that 28 years of domestic observation had been transcribed with the care of someone who understood that testimony, to be credible, requires specificity, and that specificity requires attention, and that Patience Cobb had paid attention with a thoroughness that would have impressed a trained investigator. He had also not known, and this is the dimension of the situation that the letters made newly visible to him, how thoroughly his own childhood had been shaped by the management of a secret. He could look back now at certain things he remembered from his boyhood, the way certain conversations stopped when he entered a room, the inexplicable coolness that had settled between his parents during a period in 1844 that he had been too young to parse at the time and had since attributed to ordinary domestic friction. The departure of a household servant he had barely known by name, whose absence had not been explained to the children. He could look back at those things and, Understand now that they were not random moments of domestic weather. They were the visible surface of something that had been carefully kept below the surface, specifically so that he would not understand it. This is one of the more disturbing features of the Aldridge story. Not only that harmful things had been done, but that the children of the people who did them been deliberately kept in the kind of comfortable ignorance that would allow them to carry the family name forward without the weight of what they were carrying. Henry Aldridge had been raised, in other words, to be a vehicle for his family's respectability without being told what that respectability had cost, or who had paid the cost, or that the cost existed at all. He had been prepared for succession into a world that was already in debt, in ways he was not permitted to see. What finally moved Henry Aldridge to respond was not the letter from Graves. It was a conversation 3 days later with a distant cousin who lived in New Haven and who mentioned, in the course of an apparently casual social call, that he had heard something interesting. A journalist he knew, a man named Edwin Pell, who wrote for one of the smaller New Haven papers, had been approached with a story about an old Connecticut family. The cousin didn't know the details. He had thought Henry would want to know. He said it in the tone of someone who is doing you a favor and understands that favors have weight. Henry Aldridge understood, in the space of that conversation, what Solomon Graves had actually done. The letter to the family and the letter to the journalist had not been alternative strategies deployed in sequence. They had been simultaneous. Graves had not offered Henry Aldridge a private settlement in preference to public exposure. He had offered both at once, and the letter to the journalist was not a threat to be deployed if negotiations failed. It was already deployed, already in motion, and already introducing the story of the Aldridge family into a world that Henry Aldridge could not fully see or control. The reason for this, why Graves would take an approach that maximized his leverage, but also maximized the risk of actual exposure, became clearer when Henry Aldridge began asking careful questions of people who knew Solomon Graves. What he learned was that Graves, now in his late 60s, was not well. He had a condition of the liver that his physicians expected would be fatal within the year. He had no heirs. He had, over a long career handling the private disasters of prosperous families, accumulated a great deal of knowledge that he had never been able to convert to the kind of security he wanted. Not blackmail money exactly, but something more like acknowledgement, recognition, the satisfaction of being known, even by one person, as someone who had held power over power and had used it according to his own judgment. He was, in other words, not maneuvering for money. He was maneuvering for consequence. He wanted to see what happened. This understanding did not make Henry Aldridge's position easier. It made it considerably harder, because a man who wants money can be bought, and a man who wants revenge has a price that can sometimes be identified and paid. But a man who wants to watch, who has arranged the pieces on a board and is simply waiting to see them move, is a man who is not, in any straightforward sense, negotiating at all. Henry Aldridge went to see Solomon Graves at the retired lawyer's home on Asylum Street in Hartford on the first Tuesday of May, 1889. The conversation lasted approximately 2 hours, according to a note Graves made in his personal journal, which survived, having been acquired with his other papers by a Connecticut historical archive. Graves recorded only a few lines about it. He wrote that Aldridge had come expecting to find something he could address and had left understanding that he was inside something he could not address. He wrote that Aldridge was, beneath the composure, frightened in the specific and particular way of people who have spent their lives believing that their family name was a form of protection and who have just discovered that it is, instead, a form of exposure. Graves wrote one other thing, which would have seemed cryptic to anyone who did not know the full history, that Henry Aldridge had asked, at the very end of the conversation, whether there was anything in the letters about Mercy Dunbar that indicated where she had gone. After leaving the estate in 1844, Graves had told him yes, there was, and Henry Aldridge had sat with that information for a long time before standing up, collecting his hat, and leaving. Because the letters did not only describe what had happened at the Aldridge estate in December 1843, they described what had happened to Mercy Dunbar afterward. And that, it turned out, was the part of the story that Henry Aldridge had not known, and had not expected, and from which, once he understood it, he could find no way to emerge intact. Mercy Dunbar had not gone home to Glastonbury in the spring of 1844. This was the given. The Dunbar family's tenancy on Aldridge connected land gave them every incentive to cooperate with whatever version of events the Aldridges preferred. But perhaps not a detail anyone had checked. She had told her family she was going elsewhere. Her family, understanding the nature of the relationship between tenants and landlords in such matters, had told the Aldridges she had gone home. Both were true in the sense that each party stated something they believed would satisfy the other. Neither was true in the sense that it described what actually happened. What actually happened, according to Patience Cobb's letters, was that Mercy Dunbar had gone to Hartford, not to the domestic service positions her family thought she was pursuing, but to the household of a woman named Griselda Vane, who ran an establishment on Commerce Street that occupied a category of Hartford life everyone knew existed and no one in respectable society acknowledged by name. Patience Cobb had found this out not through any dramatic investigation, but through the ordinary channels of domestic servant communication in a mid-sized city. The networks of cooks, washerwomen, and housemaids who moved between households and carried, along with laundry and market goods, the currency of what they had seen. The information had reached Patience Cobb in the autumn of 1844. She had recorded it with the same careful, unadorned specificity she used for everything else. She noted the address. She noted the name of the woman who had told her. She noted that she had confirmed the account through a second source, which she also named. And she noted, "This is the line in Patience Cobb's letter that Solomon Graves quoted verbatim in a separate memorandum he attached to the bundle. That Mercy Dunbar had not gone to Commerce Street of her own free choosing, but had been brought there by a man she named, a man who had received a payment from Harlan Aldridge Sr for the service of relocating a problem to a place where it would be, in all practical senses, invisible. The man named was a person Graves had been able to identify through Hartford city directories. He had operated in the 1840s and 1850s on the margins of a number of businesses that occupied the same oblique relationship to respectability as Griselda Vane's establishment. He was dead by 1889. Harlan Aldridge Sr was dead by 1889. Griselda Vane was dead by 1889. Mercy Dunbar herself, whether she was alive or dead, where she had gone, what had become of her after the mid-1840s, was a question Patience Cobb's letters could not answer. The trail in Cobb's account went cold in 1845. But Henry Aldridge did not need the trail to continue beyond 1845. He needed only the portion that existed. He needed only the fact that his father had taken a 17-year-old girl employed in his household, pressed upon her the kind of attention that a man of his position and her position in the year 1843 made impossible to refuse or even to clearly name. And then, when the situation had produced complications he did not wish to manage, had paid a man to remove her to a place that was not, by any standard of any era, somewhere a person is taken as an act of generosity. Henry Aldridge had grown up believing, had been permitted to believe, perhaps encouraged to believe, by the careful management of domestic history that wealthy families conduct across generations, that his father was a stern but fundamentally decent man. The insurance business, the church pew, the charitable boards, the composure in all visible circumstances, these were the materials from which a son constructs a father. And those materials, as Henry Aldridge sat in his Hartford townhouse in the first week of May 1889 and read Solomon Graves' memorandum, were dissolving. This is where it is necessary to consider what the letters meant not only to the family, but to the specific historical moment in which they surfaced. By 1889, the United States had been debating for nearly 3 decades the meaning of what had occurred before the Civil War. What had been permitted? What had been concealed? What the comfortable classes of the antebellum North had known and chosen not to examine. Hartford in 1889 was a reforming city, or at least a city that understood reform as a public value. Whatever private accommodations its prominent citizens made with the past. The newspapers covered labor questions, temperance, the condition of women, the responsibilities of the wealthy to the less fortunate. It was not, in other words, a moment when a story about a prosperous Hartford family and a 17-year-old servant girl could be received as a minor social embarrassment. It was a moment when that story meant something specific, and when the people who read it would know exactly what it meant. Edwin Pell, the journalist in New Haven whom Solomon Graves had contacted, was 34 years old and had built a modest reputation for covering stories about financial irregularities and the private behavior of prominent men. He was not, by the standards of the larger press, a powerful figure, but he was persistent, competent, and he understood that a story with documents, a story where someone had written things down in real time, and those documents had survived, was a story of a different order than one based on memory and accusation. He contacted Solomon Graves to confirm that the documents were genuine. Graves provided him not with the letters themselves, but with his memorandum, and with 3 specific passages transcribed verbatim from Patience Cobb's account, embellished with the dates and contextualizing details that would allow a careful reader to verify them against public records. The address on Commerce Street, the name of the man Harlan Sr had paid, the dates of Mercy Dunbar's employment at the Aldrich estate and of her departure. Pell spent 2 weeks checking what could be checked. The Commerce Street establishment was in city directories from the period. The man Patience Cobb had named had a documented existence. The dates of Mercy Dunbar's employment could be triangulated against parish records from Glastonbury, which listed her family and her own baptism. He went to Hartford. He asked questions of people who had known the Aldrich family in the 1840s. Most declined to speak. 2 did not. One was a retired clerk from the insurance concern who had worked there from 1840 to 1855, and who remembered Daniel Ferris with a precision that surprised Pell given the 45 years that had passed. The other was an elderly woman who had been a neighbor of the Aldrich estate, and who said only that she had always wondered about that winter, and that some things you see you cannot explain away no matter how long you try. The story appeared in the New Haven paper on June 14, 1889. It was not, by the standards of later journalism, a long piece, perhaps 4 columns, and it was written with the careful hedging of a journalist who understood libel law and the difference between what he knew and what he could prove. But it was specific. It named the Aldridge family. It described the general nature of the letters and the circumstances of their discovery. It reported what could be confirmed about Mercy Dunbar's background and employment at the estate. And it reported, in guarded but unmistakable language, the documented connection between Harlan Aldridge Sr and the Commerce Street establishment. The New Haven paper had a circulation of modest size, but stories travel in ways that circulation figures do not capture. This particular story traveled quickly. It was picked up within a week by a Hartford paper, and then by a Springfield paper, each with their own additions and framings, each adding the particular texture of a community that had known the Aldridge family in some capacity, and now found itself looking at what it had known through a new lens. The Hartford piece was notably cautious, Hartford being a city where the Aldridges had social connections that a local editor would have been aware of. But caution, when it takes the form of carefully worded non-denial, communicates almost as much as assertion. What the initial coverage did not include, because Pell had not yet received the physician's document, was any account of what had happened to Mercy Dunbar after 1845. The first article described her as a young woman who had been employed by the family and then removed from that employment under circumstances that raised questions. The questions it raised were serious enough. They situated Harlan Aldridge Sr within a pattern of behavior toward a vulnerable employee that readers of 1889, not all readers, not readers everywhere, but readers in the kind of reforming northeastern city that Hartford and New Haven had become, were primed to evaluate with a severity that would not have been universal 20 years earlier. The temperance movement had changed certain conversations. The emerging discourse around the condition of working women, the investigations into industrial labor that had produced legislative attention in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and the spreading influence of settlement house reformers who documented what actually happened to young women of limited means when the systems supposedly designed to protect them failed. All of this had created, by 1889, an audience that knew how to read between the careful lines of a newspaper story and identify the reality being described. Patience Cobb's name did not appear in any of the articles. She was referred to only as a source whose written account had been preserved and authenticated. The question of who she was, and why she had spent 28 years recording what she had seen, was left largely as an absence in the center of the narrative. This absence was noticed by some readers who wrote to the paper asking about it. Pell did not identify her publicly. He had made a decision when he understood the nature of what she had done and who she had been, that naming her served no purpose she would have endorsed. She had not wanted credit. She had wanted the truth to survive. What followed was not dramatic in the way of legal proceedings or public confrontations. It was the quieter drama of a family's position simply ceasing to be maintained. Institutions that had included Aldridges on their boards found, in the months following the articles, that the association had become complicated. Business relationships that had depended on the social weight of the Aldridge name found the same thing. The insurance concern, which had been profitable for decades, found its management transition. Henry Aldridge was in the process of handing day-to-day operations to a younger partner, complicated by questions no one asked aloud, but that everyone was asking. Henry Aldridge's younger brother, Charles, who had built a separate this response is AI-generated for reference only.